Greetings, dear friends. Today's topic is one of the most difficult ones to talk about, and that is of domestic violence. So I'd like to put a huge trigger warning because even though any of us who've been survivors of domestic violence or child abuse or abuse within a family system or from a lover or partner, um, or even a stranger. There's been sex assaults that have happened. Whenever someone has survived something pretty significant, when we begin to talk about it again, even though a lot of time has passed and we've done a significant amount of healing and processing, it's always possible to get re-triggered again. So it's important to take really good care of yourselves as you listen to this content and check in with your body to see if you're getting triggered. Be in sync with your breath if you've gone into fight or flight. And I wanted to tell you that October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So I thought it would be a good time to venture into this really exceedingly painful topic that a lot of us would rather bury and ignore. But by doing so, we wind up having the propensity for these patterns to recur in our lives. So I always think if there is dark shadow in our own lives or in our cultures or society or community, if you shed light on shadow, then the shadow doesn't have so much power over us anymore. And I believe that human beings have a great capacity to learn and to grow and to heal. So I believe that there's hope for all of us, no matter how difficult our lives have been. And anyone that's followed any of my work over the years, you know that I am a survivor of child abuse that's quite significant from my family of origin. And then, sure enough, because I wasn't really aware of that or didn't have the tools and the skills as a child to, or any support to be able to leave the family system um, and get any healing, I wound up recreating those patterns in my adult life by the partners that I chose, um, and then finding a spiritual community that also had um, structurally violent tenets to it. So I've been immersed in a lot of suppression, violence, unkindness, power dynamics, and harm for pretty much my whole life. So I'd like to talk to you about how to heal. One thing, there's a topic called being trauma informed. And that means we don't actually heal by necessarily just dumping all of our colorful stories of the abuse. It's always good to go into something like EMDR and process those memories in a professional and safe way, or with a therapist. But a lot of the times, just going through the gory details of the abuse and your abuse story winds up re-triggering you rather than healing. And that's true in the forums and as we get together online in any type of support groups. A lot of therapists and environments are not as trauma informed as they could be. So we wind up just sharing the stories of domestic violence or child abuse, and we wind up re-triggering each other. So we're always staying in this hyper vigilant, state of mind where everything's kind of up and unhealed. So I'd like to talk about methods to be safe and to begin the healing process. Now, being a survivor and a health coach, a wellness coach, I'm actually not, offering any type of emergency services. So if you are in danger, please read this article very carefully, and I'm providing lots and lots of resources as to how to get help, create a safety plan if you're experiencing domestic violence currently, or if any child is being hurt, and some resources as to how to heal. So I want to thank you for participating in this. And once again, I believe that if people can become aware of these processes and take steps to be safe and remove themselves from the abuser, to heal the very, very early wounding and the kind of what's called like karmic seeds, to wind up recreating that again and again in your life, that whole um, destructive process can be cut, and a person can really flourish even though we've gone through really difficult things. So, one interesting part about domestic violence, I was reading Bessel van der Kolk, and he has a book that's quite famous called The Body Keeps the Score. And, you know, domestic violence and child abuse and uh, child sexual abuse is much more ubiquitous than we ever had known. We used to think that it wasn't, families were pretty healthy and these things didn't happen, this dark stuff. But it turns out that so many of us, like myself, grew up with physical and sexual violence. Um, and we wind up recreating those patterns in our adult lives. So the body keeps the score, is that trauma and that propensity to feel unsafe and to be reactive winds up staying in our nervous system. So if you have studied anything about polyvagal theory, an interesting part about that is, when you feel that life is okay, and you're feeling that you're safe, um, then you're in your parasympathetic nervous system. That's also called the rest and digest, or feed and breed. And your body will produce chemicals like serotonin and endorphins, and you'll feel that the world is good and safe. But a trauma survivor, especially if it was early childhood abuse, um, will like have their entire lives be living in their sympathetic nervous system, which is the fight or flight. So you wind up having a lot of adrenaline and cortisol going through your system. You don't trust people. You're always nervous, very, very reactive, very emotionally mercurial. So that's a sign of a trauma survivor. And then the third state is once you've kind of given up and you're exhausted. You go into the ventral vagal. You go into just you give up. Um, and a lot of people, you'll start to see that if they're survivors, where they're actually in kind of a checked out, dissociated state. And I think that you're kind of numb. You're numb to your life and numb to your world. And I know social media is a great venue for us to stay in this kind of checked out, emotionally numb, stony, dissociated state. So dissociative disorders and being in the kind of like checked out, numb state is very, very common um, for the third stage of your nervous system, where you can't feel anything anymore. You've kind of given up. You're just sort of like, drudging through this life and waiting for it to end, and kind of using people to make you feel better, and dissociating through social media and being checked out. So that's not really living. And I have shut down a lot of my social media because as a trauma survivor, I could use social media to escape and to waste my time, but also to be very, very vulnerable to needing other people's confirmation to make me feel better. So using it like an emotional drug. So these are unhealthy dissociative patterns that I realized were not great for me. So at this point, I've shut down my Facebook and my Twitter, and I kind of go in and out of Instagram. So, but how to heal? Um, there are different ways to heal. So first and foremost, if anyone is in an unsafe environment, you've got to take steps to get out. And usually, an abuser who chooses to abuse, they don't have a whole lot of conscience or willingness to stop that. I mean, once kind of crossing the line into domestic violence, if you are married to an abuser, um, it's very, very likely that they'll continue that pattern without a significant intervention. So I think safety is really important. And that can be really hard because women can be financially, emotionally dependent upon their partner. And it's really, really hard to leave. So I've offered the the power and control wheel. So that's actually, this is a great model for looking at, in an honest way, how domestic violence occurs. And sometimes an interesting part of domestic violence is that you might not be experiencing sexual or physical violence in the home, but it can be done in a more covert way. And actually, that's some of the most dangerous types of power and control that happens in human relationships, is when there isn't overt sexual and physical violence. Um, the type of abuse that's more psychological, where the person feels insulted, feels controlled financially, feels that their power is being taken away and they are trapped. That's a very, very common way that women have been, um, uh, you know, oppressed for many years in domestic relationships. They might not be being hit, they might not being yelled at or sworn at or any type of overt physical or sexual violence, but it can be done more subtly. And that's how women, since time immemorial, have been trapped and controlled. And unfortunately, this is very, very ubiquitous in our culture. So please get help if you are the victim of domestic violence. And there are a lot of resources out there for us. Right now, I'm taking a class uh, called the Living Recovery Program. And that is a very, very powerful program where you can, it's extremely trauma informed. Um, uh, it's about going through the steps to um, begin to heal those patterns within us through psychoeducation and through paying attention to one's body and one's nervous system. So it's a really, really powerful course, and I'm going to send a link to that. And I'd like to talk to you a little bit about my story, and I want to again put the trigger warning on there, because once we start sharing stories, we can um, get re-triggered again. So it's generally not recommended to listen to each other's trauma stories, but I wanted to share with you just some of the highlights of what I had been through with domestic violence in my life. And also the good news is that I've consider myself a survivor, and I've recovered to a greater extent. So I wanted to tell you some of the memories that I had, and how that's brought me to where I am today. And this is the deepest you could possibly go, so bear with me. So, first and foremost, I was born into a teenage pregnancy um, where I was not wanted. And my parents were, very young. They were 19 years old, and this was 1969. And my dad was an alcoholic and violent, and he also came from an alcoholic and violent background. And I wanted to tell you that a lot of times, this is your only family that you've ever known. So sometimes it's really hard for people who are young to step back and look at what they went through and can recognize it as actual abuse. Because it wasn't until I got married and I was about 35 years old where I was starting my own family. I had actually suppressed all of the memories from my family of origin. And I actually reframed it as I came from this great family. My mother worked for the United Nations, and my grandfather was an opera singer and had money. So, and I went to a prestigious boarding school. And then I came out to Naropa and I was going to go to Columbia. Like, I actually reframed my life as actually being very privileged. And I buried the memories of the things that happened to me. And I think that's a protective mechanism. And that's kind of where you get Carl Jung's sort of like shadow and persona. So we have that within ourselves, like how we regard our own lives. We have the persona, our thought process of how we regard ourselves, the constructs of ego, and then shadow, stuff that's dark and hidden, and stuff that happened to us that we bury. And I think it's a protective or survival mechanism. So it has a place, this sort of, you know, tragedy and comedy of the dark and the light. So being in this unsavory life where I was born into domestic violence, I started to have memories at 35 years old that dated way back to the crib. And I wanted to share some of those with you because they're pretty vivid. So I grew up in a home in Newport, Rhode Island that was kind of big at these old colonial homes, and they had 3 floors. And my bedroom as a baby was on the 3rd floor, far away from the living room, so the other corner of the house. And my mother would leave the light on in the hallway. And I had a baby crib, like a traditional wooden baby crib, and I'd wear this pink onesie. So I have this very vivid memory of being a baby in the crib. And I would try to go to sleep at night, but I would hear from the downstairs my parents fighting and yelling and screaming, and it was very, very frightening. And I didn't know what it was. Um, and I just remembered, you know, crying and crying like every night. I can't remember how often this happened, but I remember it being so significant that I would cry myself to sleep. And I remember crying so much that, and I would even scream, like I would be kind of in the crib calling out like for my parents because I was so scared and I didn't know what was happening, that I would actually, I would cry at the top of my lungs for someone to come to hold me and to make me feel better. But my parents were yelling downstairs and they couldn't hear my cries over their own yelling. So I remember I would just go to sleep. Like after having cried and yelled for so long, I would actually hiccup myself. I'd be like in this completely dysregulated state where I'd be like hiccuping and so heartbroken. I remember it actually very vividly, even though I was only like a few months old. Um, I remembered thinking, why won't anybody come? And finally, just after sheer exhaustion, after crying for so long, for so many nights, I just would finally fall asleep. So that's how I would go to sleep. And I was told at that time that the world is not safe and that no one comes for you. They just leave you there to cry yourself to sleep alone. And I've had to do some work kind of like rebirthing or reparenting, where I've gone back to that memory of myself in the crib as an adult. And you can use visualization to heal these very early memories. So I'll have an image of me, um, as an adult me holding the baby and consoling and offering that type of consoling that I never got. So that's one of the healing methods that's used in EMDR. I know Scientology does this kind of stuff with clearing out um, emotional problems, going back through the past. And we actually have it in Tibetan Buddhism too. One of the practices called the Rushens. You go back into early moments of very, very deep trauma and wounding, and you heal the memory by creating a new memory of something that you would like to have happened during that time where a child was vulnerable and hurt. And then you actually come and rescue the child. So you can actually almost create new memory files. So that's a little bit about the healing. So that's a really sad thing. And um, I had mentioned this once before. I was doing a meditation retreat in Denmark, and I was having these sort of crib memories and practicing a lot. And I started to pray and wonder if someone who had been damaged as an infant in the crib, um, how could I ever recover from such early wounding? How am I ever going to be a compassionate person with any qualities whatsoever? How can I, I'm never going to have the qualities as promised in my Buddhist tradition because the wounding was so deep and so young. I didn't even have those 7 formative years of love. Um, and the message from Source came, well, it was actually really, really important that you were wounded as a child, because those seeds will actually give you the compassion to speak for other women and children who are abused and who are uh, harmed in our society. So that gives you the visceral trigger to wind up in your adult life now to help them. So Source told me that it was really important that I was abused when I was young. So and that pretty much continued on. So my mother and father got divorced when I was 3, and she was in a pretty profound dissociated state from the trauma. And I feel for her. It must have been really hard to be so young and to have this happening, a teenage pregnancy, and then your husband be a violent alcoholic. So she couldn't really be there for me because she was probably just trying to survive herself. So I have great compassion for her and what happened. And then, I was raised with her being in that state of mind from, the polyvagal system, which I think is fantastic. She was in that sort of dissociated dorsal vagal frozen state. So she was never there for me. And once she and my father divorced, and she was a single mom, from what I know, she was really in love with my father. And I looked like him. So every time she would see me, it just me, who I was. Not only was she burdened with a teenage pregnancy, now she lost the love of her life. Now she's got this constant reminder of the abuse. So every time she would see me, I could feel in her a sense of pain and it wasn't love. I think it was, she actually started to resent me for taking away her life, her freedom, her youth. And I was kind of an energetic representative of an abuser. So that was never much fun for me. She would just sit on the couch and chain smoke and kind of look out into space like something out of Looking for Mr. Goodbar. And it was like horrible. My life from my childhood was not fun. My mother remarried again when she was about 21 to someone now that was physically violent with me. So then I grew up. Now I had this early childhood wounding of violence in the crib, then being ignored and unwanted. Now a person that came into my home, a stepfather, was physically violent. And so many times per week, as I was being raised by him, I was punished for no reason. He would make up some story and, you run and grab me, like chase me around the house and grab me and pull down my pants and spank me. And I didn't even do anything wrong. This was just psychodynamics in our home. And I was punished most of the time and sent up into my room. I was an only child. and I spent most of the time in my childhood alone in my room, crying, just being sad, and trying to find some grace through like my stuffed animals and books and just being alone. I wasn't really allowed like downstairs. It was like something like, flowers in the attic. And or I spent a lot of time outside, and I did have some friends, and for that I was grateful. But being the recipient of family abuse, energetic, emotional, and physical, you don't feel strong and confident. And when I went into the school system, the kids could pick up on that vulnerability, so I was targeted by them, and I was beaten up a lot. My family didn't really take care of me. I didn't have like the best clothes, and I was kind of scruffy. So, it was very, very easy for the kids on the East Coast to target me. So I got beat up at home and beat up at school. So, when I was 13 years old, my mother divorced this second stepfather and packed up all my stuff in one box and sent me to a New England boarding school. And at that point, I got involved with, the Grateful Dead, and there were like drugs and alcohol involved there for many years. And I started to date. And sure enough, guess what type of people I started to date? I would choose, dysfunctional, alcoholic, violent people. And fast forward to me being in community college, I had found this very, very kind and gentle hippie guy from our Grateful Dead community, and he had long blonde hair, and he had a guitar, and he would play Donovan out on the outdoor grounds, and so he became my boyfriend. And someone took me aside after I had been with him for a couple weeks and said, "Your boyfriend has a history of beating up his girlfriends. You need to be careful." And I thought it was the most ridiculous thing I could ever imagine, because this person was so gentle and so kind. Everyone loved him, and he had this outer affect of this long blonde hair. He just was like this angelic kind of elfin being. So there would be no possible way there could be any type of bad thing behind the scenes. So one night we were at his house, and we got into an argument, and he wound up punching me. And there was a second incident where we had just got through finishing our classes at community college, and we were in the parking lot, and we got into another argument. And I got really scared because he had hit me before. So I actually, as he was starting to escalate, I opened up the door and I ran away from him. And he chased after me and captured me and was on top of me. And he put his hands around my neck and he strangled me until I would not breathe anymore. I actually lost consciousness. I essentially died in that moment. And I was about 18 years old. And I actually remember waking up and gasping for air, and he was above me. And I looked in his eyes, and I kid you not, they were kind of glazed over, just something out of Norman Bates, and he wasn't even there. He was in this kind of weird, frozen, dissociated state. And then when he saw that I had come back to life after he essentially killed me, I could see him turn from this dissociated state to fear, and then he ran away. I got back in my car and drove home. And I don't know how he got home. Maybe he hitchhiked. He actually drove, or he got a ride back to my house back then. And I had called the police and I told them what happened because I was really scared. And once he came back to my house, I said, "Well, we have to file a police report here because you basically strangled me." And he looked at me and he said, "I don't know what you're talking about." And this was the most frightening thing. And I actually believed him in that moment. that when he strangled me, he was in a completely dissociated state. He had grown up also with domestic violence. And so, again, according to the polyvagal theory, he was in the dorsal vagal state, completely dissociated and not even aware of what he had done. And that's really, really scary. Sometimes abusers can actually be in kind of like, it's not really multiple personality, but they can go into this sort of alternate state of mind where they're just very, very primal and they're not even aware of what they're doing, almost like an alcoholic with a blackout. So this is really, really horrible. So I could have died, and I essentially was strangled. And I actually had wound up going with about 3 or 4 different boyfriends that were violent. And of course, look at the building blocks of my life. I grew up with listening to domestic violence, to being subjected to it, and then being the victim of physical violence. It was not sexual, it was physical. But these were the whole building blocks of my life. So, I was always going to be vulnerable to these people and also seek them out. Um, the tendency to seek them out is called repetition compulsion. It's also called trauma reenactment. When you have these early seeds, you will, recreate that pattern again and again in your life. And hopefully you don't grow up to become an abuser. In my case, I was never an abuser, but I would always be in that victim role. And so my job is to have trauma education and huge amount of self-awareness to not continually put myself in that targeting role. But it still happens. So I will continue on. So, that I finally got married to a very kind person in our household. We had a child, has been very loving and supportive. So I feel that I was able to bring awareness to these patterns and heal to some degree. There were a few power dynamic things that happened in our family, but I wound up going into family counseling, and we've been able to heal that through a lot of awareness and kindness and just going very slow with how we communicate. But where the trauma reenactment or repetition compulsion continues to this day was finding an entire community through my Buddhist organization that had a lot of cult-like tenets. And they made me feel the same way that I felt when I was small. Like I had to give all of my power over to another person. And I felt that the religion used a lot of its tenets to find people to blame, like, oh, you're a demonic person if you ever would speak out against anything that was wrong, or the teacher, or bring up any conflict things amongst the community. Very heavy-handed vows, power and control, suppression. So I wound up feeling the exact same way in that community, like I was bad and I was stained and I had to serve them. Because when you grow up with people that have disorders like physical violence and the dissociated PTSD mom, you know, who had a lot of narcissistic tendencies, you wind up just becoming like a servant, and you give all your power away to these other people who have control over you. So I wound up recreating that pattern again and again. And I noticed a lot of people that come into our Dharma community come from a lot of trauma, wounding, or child abuse. And we're told that we have this kind of panacea or safe harbor of warmth and compassion and community. But behind the scenes, it's more about control, and a lot of unhealthy things happened within our community. We have a lot of very, very broken, damaged, wounded people that, will believe now that they are really holy because of their religion, put on robes, put on Nagpa robes, wear these top knots. But really behind the scenes, we have a lot of extremely damaged people that have just bypassed all of this wounding and are overcompensating from a lot of damage and trying to pretend to the world that they're holy or they've healed from it all, but there's a lot of power and exploitation that's just completely um, rampant through our community. And I'm trying to bring awareness to that, and so have a lot of us. And that's an upward battle that probably will not be resolved anytime too soon. So, one of the biggest ways that I've learned to heal is number one, to have education and awareness and accountability for what happened. Number two is to set boundaries. There's a premise that you cannot simultaneously heal from abuse and exploitation and be continually exposing yourself to it. So you have to cut off contact um, with the triggers, people, systems, and environments that keep on re-hurting you again and again and again. So, the term in our healing world is called no contact. So it could be that you have to cease connection with a family member or an entire family or an entire community if there has been exploitation and harm. So first, it's just like alcoholism. In order to heal from not drinking anymore, you have to stop drinking. You have to admit that this happened and have a firm cut from that pattern. And then you can begin to do the more deeper and subtle work. So don't expose yourself again and again and again to the traumatic environment or traumatic people. Um, Recoil and regain your own inner strength, set boundaries so that you can go inward and begin to heal. And then once you're not re-traumatizing yourself anymore in that family or environment, you can go inward and begin to grieve and to process a lot of these wounds. And those wounds can turn from moments of trauma to moments of tenderness and moments of compassion and strength. So those of us who are domestic violence survivors, it's not a death curse, a curse to be burdened and to be damaged for your entire life. I believe that real healing is possible. And I'm living proof of a person that still to this day has a really deep and meaningful life. And we can bring in authenticity, great compassion and understanding. And from that, I believe that wisdom can really help the world. So I wish you all great progress in your capacity for healing.